minutes.
And that is,
Okay. Technical issues. Can you all hear us online? Okay. All right. It's all yours.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you all for joining us this morning. Apologies for the slight delay. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Feel like we should probably go around, say our names, introduce ourselves, and we will ask him if we have a forum. I'm for Scholars. I'm very happy to be starting out first meeting as chair. Paul Duncan. Eric Wilkins. And our special guest.
Yeah, AJ Hall.
Yes.
John Willis, third member of Soil United, no longer CEO, but I am also chairman of the board of Shine Workforce Development Initiative for utility scale solar in Virginia.
Holly Leakin, AES, Market Development Director.
Greg Beebe, attorney at Gentry Lock and president of Gentry Lock Consulting.
Ken German, Virginia Department of Energy.
Mike Walsh, Sherman and Sterling.
And Ken, it appears we do not have a quorum, is that correct?
Correct.
So would you mind remind the members present and folks online what we're able to do and not do today without a quorum?
We can do anything, you can do anything except vote on material matters like minutes or resolutions or anything like that.
Excellent. So we still will be able to take minutes today, take
Absolutely.
testimony and
Absolutely.
discuss future meetings.
Absolutely. And are there any members online right now? I can't read those. I know a couple folks said they wanted to call in.
Doesn't appear so.
Okay.
Would like to remind folks who are joining us electronically, we will have time for public comments at the close of the meeting. So appreciate you virtually and looking forward to hearing from some of you all if you'd like to share some thoughts with the authority. We will skip item number 2. And before we move on to presentation on grid enhancing technologies, I'd like to add a couple items to the agenda. First, would like to add a discussion of future meeting dates and hopefully get a schedule for 2024 in the books with some venues locked down for everyone's benefit in the long term. And just would also like to discuss, well, actually just have an open discussion in case folks on the authority wants to share thoughts on activities so far and any other matters. So do I need a motion to do so, Ken?
I don't think so. One note though on meeting venues, if we're going to continue to use the libraries, which is what we've historically done, you can't book them more than 30 days in advance. So that becomes a little problematic. So unless I can find a location that we can use consistently and regularly, we can lock in the dates, but the locations might be a little more problematic.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ken, and we'll reserve time at the close for those 2 items. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce AJ Hall. I'd like to thank Colleen for making this happen. It was her suggestion at the most recent meeting to have a grid enhancing technologies presentation. So AJ, thank you for making the trip down from Indiana.
Thanks.
And then down 95 today, but excited to hear what you have to share.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. Let me pull the presentation and then I'll need to share my screen. Okay. Okay, I want to confirm for everyone online, can everyone see screen? It looks like.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so being that this is the only presentation today, I'm happy to take questions during the presentation. If there's something interesting that comes up and someone wants to just raise your hand or interrupt, happy to do that. And then I'll try to pause midway through to take questions, and I'll of course do questions at the end. But anyway, so as Skylar introduced, my name is AJ Hall. I'm a portfolio management director at AES. And this presentation is on grid enhancing technologies and how AES is exploring a suite of flexible technologies that we think can unlock transmission capacity for the energy transition. Okay, so first a little bit about AES. So first headquartered in Virginia. So, it was about an hour down 95 to get here this morning. We're a global energy company. And what's unique about AES is we not only have, mostly generation, so, 32 gigawatts in operation and a pipeline of another 5.4 under construction, but we also have utilities. So we can see both sides of the energy transition. We have 2 utilities that serve 1 million customers in Ohio. And then we serve most of the country of El Salvador with another 4 utilities and another 1.5 customers. Okay, so jumping into the presentation, what are the key takeaways? So energy demand, and especially, it was really appreciate this opportunity. It got me the opportunity to look into the interesting load growth story here in Virginia. But demand is growing rapidly and supply is queuing up to meet that demand, renewable supply. And so we'll talk about that. But really transmission capacity is a major bottleneck in delivering that supply to the growing demand. And so AES Grid Enhancing Technologies, or GETS, as it's known in the industry, as a solution to unlock this transmission. And then we'll look a little bit further into some applications for dynamic line rating, or DLR, and then storage as transmission. And then finally, finish with some recommendations on how integrating grid enhancing technologies can position Virginia as a leader in the energy transition. Okay, so this demand story, this is really interesting. So, and I'm sure as many folks in Virginia are well aware, the data center hub in Loudoun County and Data Center Alley. PJM recently revised its forecast, the grid operator for Virginia, for the Dominion area, 4 to 5% load growth over the next 15 years. And this was in January, and most of it is driven by data centers. So you can see there, it was a peak of almost 3 gigs last year. They're looking to almost double that peak by 2030 for data center load. And this is before AI really rolled out in earnest, right before ChatGPT and all of those things that are going to drive data center load. So I could see that dotted line there on the right-hand side going up even more. And then in the out years, after 2030, we're seeing, and just say similar trends across the country, more electrification from transportation of EVs and then heat pumps and other electrification of home devices really kind of tell the story later on in PJM's load forecast. So supply is queuing up to meet that demand. You can see the cumulative growth of the PJM interconnection queue here, and it's mostly renewable. You can see Virginia has 90 gigawatts, which is almost 90% renewable, and the major growth that we're seeing in solar, hybrid solar storage, and then finally standalone storage, a 50 times increase from 2018 in the queue, which is the storage is in the purple bars there. It's kind of hard to see on the graph. Yeah.
So you've got 2013 and 2022.
Yes.
I would assume that going back to like 2019 and earlier is actual, not just what's in the queue, it's what's been installed. Is that correct, or is that?
This is capacity in the queue only. So this is not looking at installed base in this graph. This is just some of it is installed. Right? Yes.
I mean, going back to like
2012,
2015, 2016, you're going to take actual data, right?
Yes.
That was installed at that point.
Yeah. This comes from Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, did a study on interconnection queues. It's been pretty popular in the industry this year. So this comes from their database. So yes, some of the 2022 or 2013 projects that are shown far left are in service, but likely actually the ones in 2019 are not.
Now, a lot of the things that are in the queue, though, and this comes from our past annual reports, I'll do a synopsis of what has dropped out of the queue, and quite a bit of what's in the queue eventually drops out of the queue.
That's
So
right.
what is the likelihood that this will actually come to fruition to that level?
Great question. Thank you for the next slide.
I get one.
So So, yeah, it's taking 5 years, right, to get through the PJM queue right now.
Yeah,
And in fact, the queue's been paused, right, for over a year as they work on queue reforms, and if you submitted a project today, it wouldn't even be looked at or studied by PJM until 2026. Yeah, yeah, so it's taking, 5 years, it used to take only 3 back in 2019 to get through the queue. And it's costly, these projects, why are they dropping out? Well, going back to the transmission capacity, there's not the capacity to connect these projects, so the network upgrade costs or the costs that the project pays, not just to, the tie line to the transmission, but the actual effect of that generation on the system or network upgrade costs. They ballooned from $29 a kilowatt in 2019 up to 240 today, and that's on average. That's active projects in the queue in the previous slide. That's the average network upgrade cost. But of course, they can drastically vary. A project that goes through might only have $5 per kilowatt, depending on the location. The average for storage, for instance, is $336 per kW. So it's becoming 5-10% of the capital costs for these projects. Just the interconnection process. And then, yeah, so why that's leading you to complete. If you look at just the data from Lawrence Berkeley, 15% of projects requested in 2017 have completed. And if you had requested a project back in 2012, 30% chance of completion. So less are completing. If you look at PJM's data, they're discounting their queue all the way down to only 5% of projects in their queue will complete. So that's why the PJM has been forecasting a resource adequacy issue with coal plants retiring and gas plants retiring faster than they can add renewables.
So if you go back to the previous slide.
Yeah, sure.
So based on that, even 2021 and 2022. Are those projects that were scheduled to be completed when they entered the queue, or is that what the estimate is now?
Yeah, the estimate is, so like those bars on the far right, the estimate would be at least 5 years. So maybe insert commercial operation dates of 2026 and 2027 for those.
So it's wider than it looks there.
Yes. That's a good question. Thank you. Okay, so, what is the root cause of this? It's really transmission capacity. Transmission capacity has not kept up with the electrification demand that we see and the demand for renewables as, regulatory and, honestly, just the economics of renewables have come down so much. And so a Princeton study that's been widely used in the industry sees that we need additional 60% of our transmission capacity by 2030. So that's building decades of transmission infrastructure in the next 7 years. And you can see, how do we do that? Well, the traditional methods are very expensive and take a long time. Siting and permitting and building new transmission can be as much as, as if you look at capacity per mile, 10,000 per megawatt mile. And this is based on data from PJM posts at project estimates for transmission improvement projects that have been submitted. So just a rough analysis of those projects. But then you can see some options for grid enhancing technologies below, such as dynamic line reading and storage and transmission, and be a solution for in a much less time and much less cost, right, than transmission. So it's something that we can consider. All right, so what are these grid enhancing technologies? So before I kind of get to the text on the left, just to cover the different technologies here, and I'll just preface this with, there's no standard in the industry on what is a grid enhancing technology. There's some that would only say 3 of these would be, a technology that can improve transmission capacity, but really, I think AES takes a broad view and says any flexible technology that can alleviate transmission capacity, whether that's demand response or something that you put in the asset on the transmission system is something we want to explore. So starting at the top left, flexible alternating current transmission systems or FACTS. These have been around for decades, right? So these are like serious capacitors that you can put on a long transmission line to compensate for reactive power, allowing you to transfer more energy. And then a modern evolution of that with solid state power electronics is power flow control. So these are solid state power electronics that be located at a substation that can kind of push and pull power away from different transmission lines. Storage and transmission, we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. But suffice to say that it's solving problems locally versus, delivering energy locally versus transmitting power over a long distance. Topology optimization looks at the grid looks for areas where you can reconfigure it that will solve contingencies or solve issues on the grid. So for instance, opening a tiebreaker at a substation, while it may be intuitive that you should always have all the breakers closed, that can't allow power to flow suboptimally. And so there's been some examples in the market of switching out switches or breakers in order to reroute power. Dynamic wiring, again, we'll touch on further, but it's monitoring ambient conditions and in the field in order to get the most out of transmission line capacity. And then finally, virtual power plant. That's, I would say, primarily like demand response programs, right? So I have an electric vehicle icon on there, but it could be EVs, basic air conditioning units, et cetera, that again solve the problem locally so you don't have to transmit as much power. All of these are solutions that should be evaluated alongside traditional upgrades. And how do they provide value? So before transmission is built, right, they can offset or defer a traditional investment and solve those network upgrades that we were talking about previously for less expensive costs. And then, during construction, all of the infrastructure that we have to build, all the transmission we have to build in the next decade or so to integrate these renewables are going to involve outages. And things like DLR, where you have a sensor that you can mount below a transmission line and get up and running in 3 months. You could do that prior to construction, mitigate that outage so you have more capacity in that line. And as soon as transmission is built, you can pull those sensors down and move them on to the next project because they're at a cost and installation time that allows you to do that. I mean, these transmission construction projects could be years long. So you can do 3-6 months preparatory work for that. And then finally, just after transmission is built, right? You consider them, if you're building a new line, consider putting some of these technologies in place, such as flexible alternating current transmission systems. You're building a long transmission line. Consider these different technologies that can make their cost benefit ratio even higher. Any questions on this slide? I know there's kind of a long overview before we'll jump into DLR and storage after this.
Will you be talking at all? So this is the technology solutioning.
Yeah.
Component of this. There is a significant regulatory, both at the FERC level as well as at the state corporation level, that has to be addressed in parallel to this in order to do this, because right now there's a number of challenges that would preclude some of this work being paid for, et cetera, et cetera.
I completely agree, and we see the regulatory push in parallel to one, investigating technologies and at the same time going to state corporation commissions and going to the RTOs like PJM and pushing for moving from pilots to demonstrations of these technologies. I get to that a little bit in the recommendations, but happy to, I think that's really where a lot of the discussion is, because a regulated utility is incentivized, it's a cost plus benefit model, right? So it's, and AES has regulated utility side. I understand that speaking carefully here, but we are also looking at what is the right way to incentivize using a cheaper, faster technology than a traditional investment, that you would earn a higher, rate of return, regulated rate of return.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think we'll maybe have some more discussion on, few slides from now. Good, so. Any other questions on the technologies? It's a real broad overview. I'm not gonna get into all 6 of these, today, but. Okay. So DLR. So the industry is, and most widespread practice across the industry is using static line ratings, which is just a conservative approach, assuming kind of worst case conditions, either summer or winter, or sometimes it's a standard rating all year, for what a conductor, the power a conductor can transmit. Which you can see on the right, it's up top right, there's different factors that affect a conductor's heating. And again, why do we care about conductors heating? Because as transmission lines heat up, they sag into an unsafe area. So there's limits to how much they can sag, as well as, really high temperatures, they can cause annealing on the conductor and damage the conductor. And so, there's 3 factors, well, really 4. One is how much current you're putting through, but other than the power you're transmitting, it's radiative cooling. So what's the ambient temperature outside? How much sunlight is hitting the conductor, or solar radiance? And then convective cooling, or wind. And that is the most, in the heat equation, that is the most important factor, is the wind and what angle it's blowing against the conductor. So FERC is already active here, and 881 requires utilities by 2025 to use ambient adjusted ratings. So take into account that radiative cooling on the conductor. However, that still makes a lot of assumptions. You're not using localized data on the transmission line. You're looking at a broad weather area and still having to use some conservative assumptions. So maybe that gets you, again, maybe 10 to 15% additional capacity on the line. But really what the technology can enable is dynamic line rating. So putting sensors in the field to monitor the assets directly and take into account that solar heating and, most importantly, the wind speed and conditions on the conductor. And so you see it, what does that do on the graph at the bottom right? On a cool, cloudy and windy day, when you take all those factors into account, you can see the amount of additional capacity or megawatts that you could transmit on a line, versus, even on a hot, sunny and calm day, it's likely DLR is going to provide ratings above and beyond what static ratings do. And of course, DLR can prevent you from hurting your conductor. You can see the line starts to dip a little bit below at the end, the red line, and dips below the blue, which is static rating. There's times when it's actually not safe to transmit as much power as the line is rated for, and the DLR can help with that as well. So how can DLR be applied? So, and AES is actually partnering with the company showing the picture there, Line Vision, our utilities in Ohio and Indiana. But, it can take less than 2 months to deploy these. Again, there's different technologies. Some involve sensors on the line. Some involve just local wind weather stations or anemometers and things like that. But it can take weeks really to deploy on a transmission line. And then, another 3 months or so to train the data in order to, get the computational fluid dynamics models and the algorithms to get to the point where they can provide dynamic line ratings. And so, just some examples in the industry, but a $500,000 or $500,000 DLR installation can offset, a $10 million transmission rebuild. And again, this is not saying that we're never going to build transmission. Of course, transmission is a solution. It's a yes, and we're going to build transmission. But DLR can, in a targeted sense, if you're building a new transmission line to solve a 10% overload, that's a great DLR solution. Now, if you have 100% overload, maybe DLR is not you're gonna need more transmission, right? But we've seen instances, in our experience where we've been able to potentially offset major transmission bills. And this is proven in the field. So actually in PJM right now, they're using DLR in their transmission operations control center. PPL won an Edison Award for this, which is an industry innovation.
So they're using it now, but are they using it to evaluate projects entering a queue?
They're using, great question. They're using an operation right now, not planning. And I'm glad you brought that up because that is the biggest push. And that goes back to Paul's question on regulatory.
Right.
It needs to be a planning solution, not just an operational solution. And those horizons are in the industry are melding together more as software tools and forecasting gets better. But it's a push we need to make in the industry to actually make a planning solution. Okay,
So that was just PPL.
yes. Now others, including I think some utilities in Virginia do have active pilots of DLR technology. I think Dominion, for instance, has some pilot.
With line vision or without?
I'm not sure exactly the vendors, but just on some brief research, yes.
So I'm just curious.
Yeah.
So this is monitoring the conditions on the line. What is it doing to actually control the conditions?
Yeah, so it's monitoring when, again, there's different technologies. Line vision uses a LiDAR sensor. You can see at the top there that actually is going to tell you how much your transmission line is sagging. But there's others that just use localized wind speed and all of them use some kind of weather data, right?
Right, but it's not actually controlling the power flow. It's just informing the operations.
Informing the operations center, hey, you are able to transmit 1600 amps on this line at this time. And it's forecasting that, right? Because it's not valuable. If you can't forecast out, because a lot of, planning and transmission operations happens in day ahead reliability studies and day ahead markets that are bid into for generators. So yeah, typically they can forecast 2 weeks out, but weather forecasts 2 weeks out are not the most accurate in the world. So they're more accurate, of course, coming into the horizon.
I'm sorry, another question. So based on that, it seems to me that your best capacity would be during the winter. Is that correct? Right?
It's actually the shoulder seasons,
Okay,
usually. Yeah,
but not when the demand, the capacity is going to be the highest necessarily.
yes, so I going back to one more slide, like you see hot, sunny, calm. So a day like today, it's 90 degrees, maybe there's not a lot of wind. Yeah, you might not get as much capacity out of the line. So that has to be factored in to your solution. Now, you might get still an additional 10%, and that might be all you need, right? And there's 2% of the year that you might not have more capacity than static line rating.
Can I expand a little on that? Because I think what John, where you were going was that because it's colder, because you're left there.
Yep.
You get more headroom, but because many utilities have winter peaking load.
Yeah, I was gonna-
Or summer.
You have more summer, the available capacity, even though you do get more margin, as you can see.
So they're always looking at the worst case scenario.
Exactly. So in the shoulder months, we have a reduction in cooling load as well as heating load. So in terms of available capacity, shoulder periods probably have the lowest demand, which then increases our headroom in hosting capacity.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And also, a lot of utilities have winter static ratings already. And so if you look at actual improvement, this would build, that blue line in the winter might be actually higher, for instance.
For the implemented seasonality.
Yeah, if they implement that. Some good questions. Thanks. Okay, so storage. So there's an example here from Germany, but there are some instances in the US we can talk about. But essentially, what storage can do is it can allow transmission lines that are typically radial connected. So think of like this example in Germany, they have all the wind generation in the north and they have the load centers in the south. And so you have a limited number of long transmission lines that can carry that power. And so if one of those lines goes out, there's, a lot of curtailment, right, that happens. And so what storage can do is when located at each end, it can provide that backup in a contingency. It can solve, it can, provide the power in the contingency and allow, both lines in the middle hanging here to transmit more power. There's a similar example in Nantucket. National Grid has, there's subsea cables that feed Nantucket, and they were looking at putting in a third subsea cable at $200 million. They decided to do a 6 megawatt, 8-hour battery to provide power at, maybe a cost of $50 million, the actual project cost, but much cheaper solution. So storage based on cost right now really needs to be applied in areas where you have very high costs for transmission upgrade or high cost to inability to find right of way for transmission. You can site storage locally, right, without major right of way. But I would say the storage and transmission in the US is not as far along in the commercialization as dynamic line ratings, but it's coming soon.
In terms of storage is applicable to.
Transmission, yes, storage as transmission sometimes it's referred to storage as a transmission only asset, storage as transmission. Obviously storage cited with renewables and for gas peaker replacements, those things, that's far along. We saw that back in the queue. But specifically for transmission, which is how right now, even in the German example, it's the full capacity of that storage is reserved for that transmission contingency. So that you can't be also using it as an asset to fit into the commercial energy market.
So it's for resource adequacy or capacity.
That's right.
You can't do that.
That's right. That's right.
So can you opine on why in the US we're behind what they're doing in Germany where we have the same capacity constraints?
I don't really have a good answer there. The example here is from Fluence, which is an AES sister company. I know, Colleen's former alma mater here. So I don't know, Colleen, do you have any comments?
It's a good question. I'm wondering if there are regulatory or policy reasons why it becomes a more accepted solution in Europe first. I think probably a lot of it is finding the right application. In Germany, very specifically, there's that, renewables in the north and load in the south. It's also a newer technology in terms of the inverter technology. So grid forming inverters rather than grid following inverters, which are the typical technology that energy storage uses. And that enables it to respond, essentially instantaneously the way that a spinning generator would. And that technology is becoming more widespread and it's a more sophisticated application of energy storage.
And AES is also looking at some opportunities within our utilities, currently that offsetting a new distribution substation in a local area by using storage as an example. So there's, like I said, I think it's coming in the next couple of years. All right, so this is my final slide on recommendations. So, and this will get back to some of the things you're talking about, Paul. So what are the things we can do here in Virginia? So we should encourage continued demonstration of new flexible grid enabling technologies. So there is increased federal funding for this right now. The DOE grant program, as well as others, offers cost shares to either utilities or even universities and other research organizations for demonstrating new technologies. And then this gets to the question here about planning processes. we need to require utilities to consider gets in the transmission and IRP planning processes and provide justification if they're not used. The next IRP cycle or the next transmission planning cycle, the utilities should be able to you should ask the question, why are you not considering grid enhancing technologies? This is a way to deliver capacity for these upcoming loads, like for instance, Data Center Alley. These customers want to be up and operational in 24 months, and you can't build transmission that fast. So as a carrot for utilities, you want this load on your system. These technologies can actually get that load onto your system faster. And then we can generate solve that interconnection queue with some of these flexible technologies and prevent, only 15% of those projects, or only 5%, let's say, in those projects in the PJM queue for the next power lab to complete. And then ultimately, load pays for all of this, whether it's if generation is more expensive to connect, or we need to build more transmission to connect data centers. Customers pay for this in their bills, and we should be looking at the best solutions, the best available technology in order to make sure that this energy transition is affordable. And then finally, on the incentives piece, I recommend advising the SEC to support regulatory incentives so grid enhancing technologies can compete on equal footing. And that can look like some performance incentive, that can look like incentives for a cost savings share, where what's the saved in rate base, and the utility can share some of that cost savings. There's some models being talked about in different jurisdictions. And FERC is pushing for this. I put a tweet in there, maybe it's called an X now or something, Elon's changes, but FERC is coming out with an interconnection NOPR, or a ruling on the interconnection NOPR that was put out last year, could be even this week. And it's going to have language that says utilities should use grid enhancing technologies as a part of the interconnection process. At least that's what the industry believes. I don't have a crystal ball. But FERC has been very active in looking at how do they recognize the same problem with limited transmission capacity, and they recognize the problem that it's going to be very expensive to build that capacity if we don't use all the tools in our toolbox. And I think that's the last slide. So,
Hey, can I
yeah, any questions?
ask a question? This is gonna be a dumb question for everybody else in the room, so I apologize. How much, if any, of our need to enhance transmission is due just to the demand side, the increased demand for electricity, versus the shift to renewables on the generation side?
I think it has to be both. Developers aren't building projects with no off taker, right? And so, yes, the queue there. I mean, go back to that PJM queue. The 297 gigawatts is more than PJM's peak of like 160 or something like that. Summer peak. So yes, not all of this is going to be built.
That's a very inflated number.
Yes.
Seven's probably like 160 or something.
Yes, I agree with you. And you gotta think that renewables don't have, the effective load carrying capacity is not their nameplate capacity, right? So we're going to build more nameplate capacity than we have peak. But yeah, to your question, I think it's both, at least from speaking from AES's standpoint, like we are not we're not looking at developing projects where we don't have an off taker. So we're seeing both. Yes, there's incredible with the demand for building renewables with the IRA. But we're also seeing off takers, and load serving entities consistently to make, demand renewable.
But it's nothing special about renewable generation. It's just the increased demand it's gonna require.
I think that was
I think it's both.
Yeah, it's both. And you gotta think too, that with the transition, these solar farms and then also wind generation is located away from the load centers typically, right? more, maybe so, than a gas or a coal or nuclear plant. And so that hence requires more
I
transmission.
mean, generation profiles highly different than you would expect from a coal plant or.
Yes.
or gas.
Yeah, because they're not, 98% online all the time. You need more transmission to share when the sun is, wind is blowing one place.
So Skylar and I and others deal with policymakers a lot, some of whom aren't super supportive of our transition renewables. And so these are the types of things that they point to and say, see these costs you're piling on
Mm.
because of the transition.
So what I would actually add to that is that this year, so for 2022, there were $20 billion of transmission congestion costs for consumers in the US. The year before that, it was 13 billion. The year before that, it was half that. So it's not that we're trying to make room for new generation and new load. It's that there isn't room for the new generation and the new load that is already there. So it's like, these are costs that can be alleviated by using GETS, by, using storage as transmission and integrating renewables that way.
So the congestion, I want to make sure I get that right. So the congestion charges, your statement suggests that instead of like the day ahead demand and the same day demand, which is, pushing us towards those congestion charges, by introduction of this into the planning process as well as the operation process, that 20 billion or 40 billion in projection, whatever the number is going to be for next year, we're shifting and reducing by getting active now. So an investment now could potentially reduce congestion charges, which are being passed on. They're either absorbed by the utility and then
And then,
manifest themselves as a GRC approval, right? A general rate case approval. Or they get passed on depending on the CNI. that they have to deal with in terms of capacity charges and ratchet charges and things of that nature.
exactly, and to take it to like a really, simple example, if you have a line that's congested today because it has a static rating, and you could apply DLR and you could increase that rating by an average of 40% or by up to 40%, then the congestion charges due to congestion on that line would go down. That's just kind of like that's the core action that would help alleviate congestion across the US.
What are besides the cost of investment, what are the counter arguments to this? Are there any besides cost?
Well, in Virginia, Dominion's not incentivized to implement it. That's.
Transmission.
Catherine Bonds. She's not on the call.
Is she on the call?
No, I don't think so.
We'll include that in minutes though. We can't take minutes at those. We can't. Okay. Joe.
I mean, is this stuff not covered by grid mod?
The DOE program or
Well,
grid?
these investments, I mean, obviously Dominion's incentivized to build more transmission and pass those costs off.
They are, so they
The-
can be capitalized by utilities.
That's right.
They're at lower cost than transmission,
Right.
so that's a
They'd
hindrance.
rather just build the transmission.
But that's a hindrance to the regulatory construct that utilities are using, not an actual hindrance to the, benefit to the grid.
Yeah, and other than incentive, which I agree is the biggest one, I think there's the trust issue too, right? So this is a technology, this is not steel and wires in the ground. So you have to build enough trust in the industry to move into that planning horizon. You have to convince, PJM and the utilities and say, yes, we can prove, we have enough data, we can prove that you're gonna get at least 5% additional capacity on this line all year. Because some major transmission lines will be rebuilt at tens of $millions of cost for a 5% overload of a contingency. So not in real time, but if this other line is out, this line is going to be overloaded by 5%, which might only happen and maybe 5% of the year. And so
Or less.
or less.
It could happen once.
So it can happen once every 10 years. And that's how some of the planning processes are. So
Absolutely.
we have the technology to move to move away from some of the conservative approaches that we've had in the past. And we have to move more toward a probabilistic planning versus deterministic that we've used.
Another barrier is the fact that PJM is not using DLR in their evaluation.
That's
of their
right.
Studies.
That's
And
right.
As a developer, I'm not gonna assume they will be sometime in the future when I'm developing a project. I'm just gonna go with what they're doing right now.
That's right.
So that's gonna keep a developer from assuming that he's not gonna have to pay for an upgrade on transmission line. He's gonna assume he's gonna have to pay it, so.
But putting aside the incentives and I get all of that, if to me it was just altruistic suddenly tomorrow, are there barriers to them doing making these types of investments? Legal barriers?
You know, as far as, you know, the technology uses, like, a lot of them use cellular networks and things to, and there's a lot of, you know, of course, data, privacy and cybersecurity that has to, you know, you're putting more sensors out there, but that's nothing new than the smart grid or grid mod programs that probably Dominion's already working on. So no, I don't really see a material barrier from a legal standpoint. I mean, the industry from a DLR, honestly, almost everything on this page, maybe except for, you know, the VPP, which is domain response as well. You know, and then the facts on the top left is pretty well known. You know, they are somewhat new, and there's a lot of, you know, companies doing pilots, and few have operationalized it. As I mentioned, I didn't have a really good US example of storage and transmission other than Nantucket, so there's not a lot of market traction, but it's coming. That's why, you know, Colleen and I are both in our new energy technologies group at AES. And so, you know, at AES as well as a lot of other companies, I think including, like I said, including Dominion, I believe, are looking into some of these technologies.
So, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So from AES's perspective, and I know obviously you're representing your company's position here. You had a comment there about getting the SEC to support regulator incentives. So that gets can compete on equal footing with traditional upgrades. That's an alternatives analysis that has to be introduced. That's the fundamental component because the SEC, and we know the engineering group at the SEC, they don't have the resources to do this, let alone advise the non-engineering side of the SEC on how to best proceed. So in your perfect world, where do you see Virginia, the SEC, and by the way, the SEC doesn't direct PJM.
Yes.
They direct the state of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and FERC and PJM have the overall umbrella on transmission jurisdiction and what happens. So now you set up a contest between these two entities where they're not necessarily aligned in objectives or their processes. How do we address that? And what's our role here to influence that and bring those worlds together?
I mean, so going to the first recommendation, one, we need more market traction. So we need to do more pilots and then further operationalizations. So like PPL did, right? So if you prove the technology, it's hard for regulators to say, well, this is unproven. This is, you know, this is not what we should do. AES, so we are also in MISO because we have a utility in Indiana. So we recently presented at their planning, it's called a planning activity committee, where they govern how do we plan our transmission. And so we presented a similar presentation there. So I think AES is working at all levels. So we're working with FERC, we're submitting comments to, you know, FERC, DOE, I would say is very, like FERC is very active. You know, we are working at the congressional level as well on some of these initiatives, but of course, you know, Congress moves at its own pace, so we recognize that. And then, so yeah, we're working PJM and MISO, and then with our utilities, we're actually looking not just in our own, but we're looking at other utilities in our serving territories where AES might have projects, and going to that utility and saying, hey, we think we can do DLR here to mitigate this network upgrade, and having them say, you know, they can say yes or no, but we're going to bring that issue up to the Regional Transmission Organization, or RTO, and keep pushing that envelope. So I think you have to kind of work that at all levels. And we have seen that, again, DOE for from the top side of that sandwich they were talking about, I think they are pushing for this. We've seen a lot of traction on that.
And I would just add to that, I think that, of course, SEC, they don't have jurisdiction over PJM but, we do need to implement FERC 881 in a way in Virginia. And if in Virginia, we say, hey, we're implementing 881 with a preference of using DLR, that is a good message to send to FERC to say, this is how we've implemented ambient adjusted ratings. We have done something that qualifies for ambient adjusted and goes beyond that. We've used the best available technology that we can use to do that. And then on PJM side, what's great about already having a pilot example in PJM, you can go to PJM's website and under the transmission operations line ratings, you can download the every day's DLR ratings on the lines that it's being used on. And so that process is already in place to operationalize DLR and PJM. And so that's, where Dominion can.
So what is there is just continued awareness, education, and effectively laying out the roadmap for how SEC is going to do this, how PJM and SCC could work together.
Yeah.
Sounds like we need legislation. Yeah.
So that's my question. Greg might be able to answer this, but in order for these recommendations that you make, AJ, to take effect, requiring utilities to consider GTs and then advising the SEC, which both of those require legislation. Would the advice of the SEC be something the governor could do unilaterally?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure.
Well, yeah, that's why I was asking if this stuff's covered by the grid mod bill.
And when you go back to the legislation that's been passed, like to get the solar legislation, utility scale solar, I think it'd be the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, to direct the SEC to interpret the rules liberally to let those sort of projects go through easier than other projects.
Yeah, I mean, the SEC has some general, like ratepayer protection language that they can, if they were a little more aggressive of a utility regulatory body, could extend to saying we can direct some of these things, but that's totally different than Virginia's ever done. So certainly if you're going to try to direct, SEC's not going to have the power to direct it be done.
Right, all legislation can do, I think, is tell them they can interpret the existing rules liberally to give those projects preference.
And I mean, you could pass a bill that says the SEC can only approve costs submitted by Dominion where, these technologies are. You could do that.
That's it. Now,
Right. I mean, that's literally, you could pass a bill that did that if you had the votes.
Could you say a certain amount of investment in GETs or a certain amount of investment in pilot projects would be in public interest?
Yeah, although everybody's hating the public interest language more and more.
Yeah.
Remember the administration last week, they said they're trying to get rid of as much of that as they can. No, you could make it clear what they can be reimbursed on. You could say they shall consider these as a lower cost alternative. There's lots of ways you could put it in there. And there are already times where, the opposite of this is like the SEC said, hey, the wind project, that's super expensive, but we're not allowed to say you can't do it. Therefore, we're going to let you do it. But had you not said we can't say that, we would have told you can't do that project.
When it comes to Dominion, it really comes down to what's best for them. And if it's the bottom line, it's better for them to build a transmission, that's what they're gonna do.
well, they have a fiduciary responsibility. They're shareholders, just like AES does.
Right, yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a corporation. That's a whole
Unless-
corporation.
Unless you, as we did with solar, say a certain amount of this is in the public interest.
And so then the way you used to do this in Virginia is with pilot program legislated.
I go back to though, it is in Dominion's interest to put more data center numbers than at that level.
Well,
And so this is something you could do in 6 months on an existing transmission line. in Northern Virginia that is where they're looking at major 500 kV upgrades, things like that are gonna take years. So to me, AES is seeing the same thing. So the initial use cases are, we're seeing a lot of, like Honda, for instance, just announcing a battery factory in southern Ohio that's in our service territory.
But that isn't
And so-
certain that the existing problem.
Yes.
Of getting solar on the grid, because it's not gonna be evaluated. Yeah,
Yes, but to me, if you're a utility doing that for a customer, how are you not doing that for generation as well, right?
It's not part of the process.
Yeah.
that's.
But it is a wedge. It's saying you now have this on you're now evaluating this as part of your toolbox for integrating load. It should also be, again, I think it still advances the narrative. There is a barrier. I admit it's not the same as integrating
Well,
load for generation is the exact same.
I think to the extent that a corporation has a primary obligation of safety and reliability.
Yep.
Secondary obligations to shareholders. That's as a public corporation. We have to align the technologies and the alternatives analysis so that if this is possible to meet that level of cost reimbursable or fair value, then it has to be, presented that way. If you don't do that, just because it's a technology solution, it is not necessarily able to, people who are not technology folks are not necessarily going to be able to make the financial jump in the alternatives analysis to say this is a better solution. And I think that's what the industry needs to do here in order to move this forward. Because the do nothing solution is a powerful momentum, solution on how we operate the grid, because safety and reliability is the first thing. So I think the onus is on industry to put this in a way and demonstrate to the regulators and demonstrate to the ISO RTOs that this is a viable solution and it does alleviate some of the capacity constraints and can be used as part of the planning process for dynamic ratings to give you some breath and maybe allow some of these projects to go forward. I don't think it's been demonstrated. At least not to the extent where people would have confidence to adopt. And that's the demonstration projects that I think everybody needs to do.
Yes, agreed.
With that, thank you so much, AJ. We'll keep you around in case there's extra time or additional questions during open discussion, but appreciate you taking the time to be here and filling us in on an exciting topic. So thank you.
So we get a copy of that, so.
Yeah, would you be willing to share one?
Yes.
And
Yep.
thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Moving on, now that Ken's back, perfect timing, Ken. Want to briefly discuss the annual report and what we can be doing to prepare for this fall. I'll have Ken remind us of the instructions that the administration has given us on a shortened report and a harsh deadline, or a deadline that they expect us to meet this year. But before we do so, I shared copies of essentially the legislation that renewed the Solar Energy Development and Energy Storage Authority until 2025. I just want to call to everyone's attention a few different items in terms of the purpose, among other things, of the authorities to facilitate, coordinate, and support the development of these technologies in Virginia and promote the Commonwealth's solar and energy storage industries, positioning the Commonwealth as a leader in research, development, commercialization, manufacturing, and deployment of energy storage and solar energy technology. In terms of the powers and duties of the authority, you have the entire list, but I'll call your attention to number 11. Identify and take steps to mitigate existing state and regulatory or administrative barriers to the development of solar energy and energy storage industries, including facilitating any permitting processes. Number 13, collaborate with entities, including institutions of higher education, that increase training, development, workforce needed by the solar and energy storage industries. 15, promote collaborative efforts among the Commonwealth's public and private institutions, higher education and research, development and commercialization of efforts related to energy storage, and 16, to monitor developments of energy storage technology and deployment nationally and disseminate relevant information and research results. And in terms of the requirement to submit an annual report, it's rather vague, but it says two things. We need to include in the report our activities of the authority, as well as recommendations to the governor, to the leaders of the General Assembly, including the relevant committees. So with this report and a more digestible 10 to 15 page package, we hope to take a step forward this year and make some recommendations and follow what the authority was set out to do in legislation, in hopes that the General Assembly and the governor sees fit to extend it past 2025. So Ken, would you remind us briefly about what the report will look like?
Well, I don't have the guidance in front of me, but generally it's keep it short, keep it to what the authority actually worked on. Don't go into items that are outside of what the authority has looked at over the past year. And that's basically what the entire report in the past has been. It's what is happening in Virginia. And if it doesn't have anything to directly do with the authority, apparently they don't want to see it.
Yep. Well, I hope that frees up some brain power of authority members and for staff to get a very solid, shorter list of recommendations and summaries of activities.
And in the past, the authority has never made any recommendations. They chose to instead do this very long, kind of narrative on what's going on in Virginia.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
So I don't remember this bill in 2015 when we voted on it, so I apologize. I don't remember the pitch of it, but it's interesting to me that this is not a commission, it's an authority. And it's a political subdivision, and it has significant powers beyond advising and making suggestions. I mean, in theory, this authority could develop solar projects. I'm not suggesting that's a good idea. But I mean, I was on the code commission. The code commission evaluates legislative ideas, evaluates proposals, takes feedback, and makes recommendations. That's what a commission does. It's not an authority. It's not a political subdivision. Political subdivisions can borrow money, invest money, run programs, all kinds of things. To me, and I don't remember how it was pitched, but I feel like my impression is this is kind of acted as a commission. Maybe that's what it ought to be, and maybe it ought to be reenacted as a commission, not an authority. But I'd be curious for folks to spend some time actually reading 1902, what it can actually do, and is there space to actually make advances using the unique powers given to an authority. So I don't have any answers. I had never read the enabling legislation until I'm sure I read it when I voted on it, but.
Yeah, I think it was a Hugo bill, from what I've been able to gather. But
I was one of the people that lobbied for it back in the day, but it's been a long time. It was just at that point in time, we wanted to get something going in Virginia regarding solar. We're kind of throwing spaghetti on the wall, seeing what might stick.
Yeah.
And we thought having an authority like this would help that. But at the same time, we were also working with the Dominion to get the 500 megawatt and then the 5 gigawatt and everything else passed. So anyway, here we are.
Yeah, and maybe in a pre-Clean Economy Act world, maybe there was a different vision for how you advance solar, and maybe now you don't need authority.
Yeah, I'm not saying we don't need it. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying at that point in time, I think it was developed for something different. We're here now.
Yeah.
I think we should try to look at what we have here and do what we can. I've talked about this before. I know we focus a lot on utility scale solar. There's so many working groups working on utility scale solar. I always kind of thought that maybe this group should focus on behind the meter installations, but that's just my thought.
Well, literally right now, the SEC work group on DER resources is meeting.
Well, it's broad.
Yeah. I don't
It
know.
includes all the above.
Right. I don't know what direction it'll go in.
And I think initially that and a lot of the intent was for the authority to focus on behind meter, net meter installation.
Yeah.
But, like, again, the market in Virginia has become something different.
Yeah.
So Greg, so to that point that you bring up, right? So you're right, we do have broad powers. Right, we have no budget.
No quorum.
Well, right now, well, we not worry about that part of it, but one of the things, and Ken, by saying, you know, we haven't made recommendations. I mean, clearly there have been some opportunities for us to either call in specialists and get advisement. There are the disconnects that we see at the state level versus the federal level, and those are creating basically impediments for forward progress and some of the things of which we have the right to say something. So perhaps this is our opportunity in those 15 pages to address one of the problems that we're seeing or several of the problems and come up with strong recommendations. Whether they're accepted by leadership, state leadership is, you know, to be determined, but of course, I think that's what the authority could do, and we would have a basis, a path. And that's often all that leadership needs is a potential path for people to look at and then iterate to reality. How do we actually implement things? So I think as a starting point, Skylar, I think if we could do something like that, that could be useful and not necessarily require a budget per se, but would require folks to think about what budgets would be required if we were to implement this type of roadmap, which is something we don't have right now.
And you were appointed as an independent authority. Make the recommendations regardless of what you think they're going to think about them. That's my advice. They might not like them, but if you as a group feel these are important things that need to take place to move the market forward, and make the recommendations. I see several right from this presentation we just saw that we can put forward.
To add, just on the, what have we done in the past? I want to remind the group that we have executed a storage in Virginia study. That was in, I want to say 2018.
I believe, yeah.
And I forget how we received funds to execute that.
We paid for it.
We paid the authority?
No,
Okay,
Yeah.
It was a budget amount too, right? Was that included by?
I can't remember whether that was state funds or whether we used federal funds for that, to be honest with you. I'd have to go back and look.
and I believe that was, I mean, the recommendation coming out of that report was some 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts of energy storage in the public interest of Virginia, which then that next legislative session.
Well,
was
actually,
the-
they only shot for
Maybe less.
1,000.
Okay,
And then in the legislation, they far exceeded
they
that.
far exceeded.
But there
Okay.
were lots of other recommendations in there also
Yeah.
that may or may not still be valid. I don't know. The world has changed so much.
In the last 4 years,
Yeah.
yeah, but
Maybe
that,
go back to the strategy report and see
We
what they
should-
got right.
remind ourselves, yeah.
So we will have, Ken, please chime in here. We'll have, the summary of minutes from the presentations we heard on the 28th of April. We'll have AJ's report, and then hopefully the next agenda item, talk about who else we want to hear from in order to summarize our current activities and then take that step forward to make recommendations. How do we as an authority want to begin drafting this? How do we want to formulate this report? Are we going to ask Ken and his team to develop a draft, maybe first compile a lot of the minutes, take some of the takeaways from each of the presentations and list those out? How do we want to operate as an authority to get this document started before our next meeting in September so that we can meet that October deadline?
Let me ask a question. So in the past, I'm not saying that I think it's what we should do. We had always kind of shied away from, we've been been factual with information. I don't know if we had really been out there putting out recommendations on for action. Am I wrong?
On what?
In the annual report, have we, it seems like we've been kind of, this is the state of the solar industry in Virginia. Have we provided, actual recommendations for legislation?
You have not.
I didn't think so. Would it be inappropriate to do that?
Nope.
Okay.
The language of the report is just, thing what Kim was mentioning earlier, with the direction from the director of the department is, don't give a summary of what the industry looks like. Summarize your activities and make recommendations to the governor and to the General Assembly. So it's going to free us up to give a short report and give us the opportunity to make those
Yes.
recommendations.
And we have a director who is very attuned to these issues and is looking for feedback.
Yeah. And in
Yes.
conversations with folks within the administration, they understand how important this is. They understand how much demand there is for new energy. And they're looking for advice and recommendations. So I think that there will be more interest this year in reading this 15-page report than in years past. The director was at our last in-person meeting, and so was the Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Trade. So they are checking on us on a regular basis, and I want to see this.
And so what my comment is to the role of authority is, it doesn't just have to be, hey, General Assembly should pass this policy. It could be, hey, General Assembly, use the authority this way to help advance the policy that you're looking for. And whether it's a place to receive federal monies and issue grants to try to run pilots on some of these programs, or like, it could literally be that. Again, I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying the administration wants to give up control. I'm not, whatever. But the recommendations could be a role for this group to play, not just suggesting ideas, but actually implementing things to advance the industry.
Anybody else have any thoughts on how to move forward with the report? Well, Ken, would you be willing to work with your team to develop kind of a framework for us to take a look at over the next month or so, summarizing what we've heard during our meetings in 2023, and at least listing out some of the recommendations that have been made by our presenters for our consideration at the next meeting?
Sure.
Appreciate that.
My team will be me. Thanks.
I'm hoping Aaron will help you.
Is he online?
Yes.
He was, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure I can get some information. He's been working very closely with the localities, and there are issues out there.
Great. And I'd love to get some eyes on this and send it out to the authority as soon as we're ready to first comments before the hopeful September meeting. Hearing no further discussion, let's move on to a brainstorm of future presentation topics. Colleen, I believe you mentioned this in our last meeting, and we discussed offline a desire to have the data center companies or the data center coalitions to come share their perspectives on how they want to consume solar energy and how quickly they need to see this new energy come online, as demonstrated by AJ's report. I had conversations with a data center operator who is going to point us in the direction of the data center coalition that's active in Virginia, thinking that the data center coalition will be a little bit more free to share some thoughts and recommendations that an individual company might not be able to. So there's one opportunity that we can reach out to. Thank you for that recommendation. I'd like to hear the thoughts of the authority, but last time I mentioned the desire to hear from local leaders. I've since had had conversations with a few different counties, as well as VACO, with some wishy-washy commitments on whether they would want to or whether they can come present their perspective on local permitting to the authority. I believe the line from VACO was they might be able to after their annual meeting this fall. That would be too late, but I'd like to extend a second formal invitation to them to come share their thoughts. I know they're very active in this, in the solar permitting conversations at the county level and serve as a resource to many counties. And I figured VACO would be a phenomenal way to consolidate the thoughts and the feelings of folks at the county level. So I'll put a pin in that, but I have tried. Also wanted to potentially get an update from storage developers. I know we have DeLorean represented on the authority, but there are several other developers developing standalone storage in Virginia. I've shared the 2018 report with one of them and asked, hey, is this still what you're seeing, or do you have any updates or thoughts that you'd be willing to share with the authority? I think they're interested in sharing an update of development from their perspective. This being East Point Energy based in Charlottesville, very open to others, and I'd hope DeLorean would be able to chime in as well. And lastly, there's been talk over the last several years about a change in the way permitting and siting takes place in Virginia. We saw the budget amendment this past session to create a task force to study ways to alter local control or local authority over siting agreements with these projects. Our friend in the Energy Department, Aaron Berryhill, is aware of the models that other states have pursued and how other models of siting have happened. If it's interesting to the authority, I think Aaron would be up for presenting a summary of other states to share with authority members other models that maybe don't take the control completely away from localities. Maybe you're split, maybe some examples of where no local zoning authority is exercised. So just a few ideas, but very open to recommendations of others here. We'll need to start planning and getting some presentations lined up for a September meeting.
We set a date for September yet.
I sent the doodle poll. No, I didn't send the doodle poll.
Well,
That
we'll
was
discuss that
what you wanted to discuss, is locking in dates for the whole year.
Yeah, in 2024.
I would like to, I wish Catherine were here. So I would like to hear Dominion. I'd like to have somebody from both the transmission operations group, as well as from a planning group, just to get how they do their processes and what do they see as the impediments, because I know they're challenged. They are frustrated. In disclosure, the company I work for, we have a relationship with Dominion. So we know some of the challenges they are facing, and I don't know if, they're easily overcome just because of the regulatory things that we talked about earlier. But we also have in the Commonwealth, we have American Electric Power, right, or AP, or Appalachian Electric Power. And I think they too, although they have a very, very small footprint relative to what Dominion has, I think they too have some perspective, especially in Appalachia in general. So there's going to be some of the same resource allocation challenges in PJM. So, I mean, to the extent that we can get, let's talk with Calvin and see if it makes sense, and if there's no conflict, I would love to have Dominion tell us what they're up to.
One of the things that we're ignoring is our cooperatives, and they have a lot more latitude to do really whatever they want to do, provided their members agree to it.
Right.
So, if I don't know, if I'm not in that sector, but if.
Well, I am.
Okay, well, I mean, as far as yes, I'm not in a deal and all that, but if we know that there is a cooperative out there that is open to really get into that, determining how much it does open up capacity, put up grid, then we should.
So
Sense.
So obviously the rural electric cooperative groups in the Commonwealth, I think there are a couple that could at least touch base with. They're surrounded, they get their power from Dominion, yeah, and that group, exactly. So I think there's that. I think there's Novak that also has, surrounded, gets to the power. So there are certain challenges that they have. I think would also be useful. And you're right, they don't have nearly the constraint issues from the regulatory
They
process.
don't have shareholder standards to, they have member standards,
Yeah.
the members make stuff, situation.
Yes. And they all have to work together, right? So that's the nice thing about it, is that if you can get some of the smaller cooperative students, and then there are with public power, there's also that avenue, with APA and things like that.
Although Novak is not in that group. They're not in the managed cooperative group.
Right.
But that's,
But they're still feeling the same pressure to storage.
right, they have the same operations.
So Paul, if Dominion, AP or co-ops would come to Berlin, would you be willing to quarterback that for the authority and check in and see if they have an interest and availability to
Yeah,
consider their perspectives?
yeah, I mean, no, I'll reach out.
I talked to Sam Bromberg from the co-ops.
Yeah,
He's sort of the regulatory brain for all of them.
except Novak.
Another issue on the horizon is what comes out of this HB 206 group. I went to that meeting yesterday, and I'm a cynic by nature, but whatever comes out of that PBR modification can have a really chilling effect on the market. And I might put one of our guests on the spot here to get his opinion.
Well, thanks. Vice Mayor, Commonwealth Energy Partners, CDP Solar based in Richmond, later. So with me and Power, I said that camera on me too, so. I can appreciate, the site perspective on that. Part of my job responsibilities is to be the optimist sometimes as the solar developer, and having worked on that 206 regulatory advisory panel both last summer and this summer, I see a lot more progress being made this year, in basically, finding a structure that allows for inputs from various stakeholders to calculate what the ultimate mitigation would be. I don't know that, it would be certainly time here or part of this agenda to go into any of those details, and there are a bunch of other like FOIA limitations on it. But what I would say is just that it's been a lengthy process, and I think that, everyone has recognized the need to acknowledge the fact that House Bill 206 has already set the fact that there needs to be mitigation for solar projects that have more than 10 acres of prime farmland or 50 acres of forest land. And so when you hit those thresholds, that then needs to trigger a process. And so the productive part has been, now there is a construct to facilitate that, starting with calculating the amount of land based upon certain macro level data, on-site verifications, and other types of credits that could be applied to projects, whether they incorporate agrivoltaics or other types of elements that still, help sustain local agricultural economies. So all that's being put together, kind of like you alluded to, like a big old pot for folks to stir up and make comments on. But I do think that we're in a much better place than we were last year, and I'm feeling more optimistic that we'll have something that DEQ ultimately can submit at the end of the year as part of the report.
Let me ask you, I'm kind of out of the loop on the feedback. So I was on the RAP group 3 years ago, the regulatory advisory panel for the new PBR rules. That I'm pretty sure that's never been implemented. That's still sitting somewhere, being reviewed. So is this superseding that? Is that gonna,
It does, they're moving in parallel, so you are correct that the RAP that addressed DEQ's PBR grant modifications for solar from a couple years ago. That process more or less concluded through the stakeholder discussions, but then didn't proceed into actually being
and then COVID kind of shut down the talks and
parts of
everything.
that. And so a part of this, yes, DEQ, I think, is envisioning folding in some elements from those discussions as a part of their recommendations. Here at the end of this.
I remember the one thing that was just huge in the recommendations that came out of that group was mitigation for the environmental zones. I can't remember what that. Yes, the cores, yeah. That was, it was just so vague, and the mitigation that would be required, that it just, is that gonna be addressed at all? Is that?
I think it will be, yep, so it's all to be determined in terms of what the final puts out, but that's one of the factors that would be weighed when calculating what's the amount of mitigation. Maybe the total problem.
Because when DEQ sent their final recommendations to, what the governor or Department of Energy, whoever it went to, we responded. I don't, have you seen that response from, I think, from Will Reisinger?
Yeah, I mean, that would have been a couple of years ago.
Right, okay. But it addressed all those issues that we had, the industry had.
I think the broader point is that, yes, these things are all interconnected in terms of to how do we make this transition effectively, timely, cost effectively, how do we do all these things? It's transmission, addressing the transmission constraints, addressing the permitting constraints, addressing a number of factors. So yeah, there's a lot of activity.
And also grandfathering projects that have assumed things were gonna be a certain way.
Well, moving on, setting times and days for our future meetings. Would like to first set a date for this September, and per the conversation on the last meeting, would like to propose Wednesday, September 13th, venue TBD. But the second, I guess that would put us a week after the Labor Day holiday. And so let's start with that. I know folks had generally said Wednesdays work. Hoping a date 2 or so months from now with some notifications to members would be sufficient to have a quorum. Does that pose any issues for folks here?
10 o'clock. You talking about the same time?
Unless we wanted to push it to the afternoon,
I can do the morning, I can't do the afternoon.
keep it in the morning.
Does morning work better for the folks coming from up north? Especially if you know you can take the train now.
Well, if we're coming to, yeah, I think that works very well.
Okay, if,
Yeah,
that means we'll get the spot, but that's all right.
Well,
I mean.
10 a.m. might not work here if they don't open until 10.
Oh, good point.
Mm.
10:30.
But Paul was sharing comments before the meeting. Did the authority used to meet at this state capitol?
Yep.
And
Won't let us anymore.
who makes that call?
Oh.
Someone in the Capitol,
Or
Madam Clerk.
I believe so, yeah.
that was convenient
It
and
was, except for parking was a little more problematic.
Well, I think when the new
This
assembly building
or
opens,
people coming.
there'll be a lot more availability.
And then we met a couple times at DEQ down at, what's it, 12th and Main, and we can't meet there anymore either, so.
There's
Well,
another library, not the one we met at last time, but maybe 1 or 2 meetings before that. Also that I thought,
Fairfield, I believe, the really fancy new. nice
really
one.
new one, yeah,
Yeah,
that's a nice one.
Was yesterday's wrap at DEQ?
It was.
That's what it was, the first one. That building out in.
yeah,
Pittsburgh.
yeah.
We can do.
Well, and that's an option too. I can see about whether we can get that
I
space.
don't know if people want to come downtown, but we've got space. I mean, we're in the truest building, so there's tons of conference rooms in there. We don't get, I mean, it's a pain for people who aren't used to going downtown.
What about Fredericksburg?
I looked into Fredericksburg, their library system. I need to get a library card. So.
Into 2024, going back to the last meeting. Can't remember if it was the one we held virtually before, we pitched having a quarterly date where it would recur as this first or second Wednesday of every quarter. I've taken a look at the calendar for 2024, and it looks like the second Wednesday of each quarter misses a lot of major holidays, and I would propose that as meeting times or meeting dates for 2024. That would be January 10th, April 10th, July 10th, and October 9th. Anybody have any thoughts, comments to share on
I mean,
that proposal?
I don't know if it matters to anybody else. January 10th, first day of session. I don't know if anybody cares about that. I won't be at this meeting in January 10th. But that's okay.
Can we get back to the, we said on September 13th, then we don't have a location, is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
What about a December meeting? Do you want to have a December meeting?
Of this year?
Yeah.
It is at the will of the authority. So to stick on the conversation of 2023, the thought with September 13th would be to hear final comments from presenters, to have a wider group discussion on the report with draft in hand, and then to have it ready by the October 15th deadline. We could utilize the first week of October to do a virtual meeting to take a final look at the report if we would like.
Well, again, remember, it needs to go through the secretary's office before it's submitted officially. So that's why you need to have it done sometime as soon in September as you can, so we can get their review on it. Like when we talked on the phone, I think now that with these new guidelines, it's more likely that they can turn it around quickly versus a 165-page report.
Okay,
So,
well, we'll put a pin in a potential virtual meeting in October, but that's still being the thought for the September 13th meeting. With the potential difficulty of January 10. Does this sound good to you all? Would we propose moving into January 9?
yeah,
That Tuesday? Okay. So Ken, let's share calendar invites with members of the authority. We'll do second Tuesday of the year in 2024 to remove that conflict with the first day of session, and then
just for January.
just for January.
Okay.
And then we'll stick with the Wednesdays that folks said were convenient for the second Tuesday of every other quarter in 2024.
Second Wednesday.
Excuse me. Yes, yes. April 10, July 10, on October 9th.
Okay.
Great.
I can't remember if you said it. Are we gonna recommend in the 2024 session that they extend the deadline on the authority?
That could be a recommendation that we make in our report. I think it's it is up to the legislature and the governor if they want to. I think the governor has a priority of not having authorities that aren't being helpful. They've expressed that. I think we need to prove ourselves to be helpful and, a tool for them. They do want to shrink the size of government, but we could make that recommendation.
This is not costing them anything. I mean, you're a volunteer authority, so.
Well, it's true, it's costing every member their time and their commitment, but it's still their
Yeah.
position. So couple last things to mention. We have at least one vacancy now. Angela King sent us an email and she is resigning from the authority, just citing work complications and the need for her time down in Hampton. And we also received an email from Chase Counts, and it did not come with a official resignation, but he is moving out of state. So that might mean
That, yeah, you have to be a citizen of Virginia to serve.
so 2 additional vacancies
And
to die of their.
Which spots do they fill?
So Cleena was a
The governor's appointee.
governor's appointee.
And I can't remember whether
Okay.
Chase was Senate.
Chase is from the Senate and Angela was from the Speaker. So there are a few availabilities.
And Senate rules makes the appointment.
Yes, sir.
Well, they won't do anything till next year. But Todd will appoint somebody if you ask him to.
I need to.
Sounds like it. Unless he wants to kill the authority, then he won't. Which is also a possibility. Since he voted against the bill in 2015.
So wanted to raise that for you all. They sent their regrets, but we first thank them for their service to the authority. And then also wanted to raise the issue of the website. Got an email last week asking about the Solar Authority's website and whether that will be a tool that the authority uses to keep the public updated and engaged. Ken let me know that the website, along with many others, are undergoing an overhaul by the folks down at the Big Stone Gap.
Moved behind the Commonwealth's domain.
Excellent. So we'll probably say goodbye to that old website
Yes.
sometime soon, and that the new website, whenever that takes place, can be a more a more up-to-date representation of the work of the authority. Great. Is there any other discussion from any of the members on any topic? Any more questions for AJ?
In terms of the vacancies, is there an announcement anywhere that I could reference if I had recommendations of people to apply?
If you have recommendations, I would recommend to them that they go on to the governor's website, and there's a page on there where you can put your name in the hat to serve on different boards and authorities.
And that's for the governor appointee and senate.
It
and-
is, I
Okay.
believe so. I don't think there's anything separate for the House and Senate.
Okay,
I would go to the house and use that list.
I don't
I think they just. Good people.
I have no idea, yeah. I know that governor's appointees tend to happen much sooner than House and Senate appointees.
Yeah, I suggest if you have someone who you want the speaker to appoint, you talk to Skylar and ask him to communicate to,
How do you do it?
I mean, I'd be happy to be on the email.
Yeah, I know the person who takes care of that, and
Okay.
they're usually amenable to recommendations.
okay.
All right, I know we still have several members of the public still joining online, so I will open it up for a public comment. If anybody in person, whether that's Tyson or my colleague Jacob Carosella with Energy Right, would like to share any public comments. Do we need to unmute anybody or? can we
No,
unmute
I think
ourselves?
should all. Well,
I'll just start.
how do you unmute all?
They can raise their hand or.
Yeah.
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 Going once, going twice, anybody on the Teams link want to share public comment with the authority?
They do, they raise their hand and be at the top of the list.
Excellent. Well, with that, thank you everyone for coming. I think we have our work cut out for us prior to the September 13th meeting. Lining up additional folks to present to the authority, developing a framework for the 10-15 page report. And moving towards that report and making it as salient and useful to the Governor and General Assembly as possible. I will entertain a motion to adjourn until 10 a.m. on September 13th.
So moved.
We have a second.
Second.
Excellent. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, they are hard.
There's all.
You're at ESPN.